Hi everyone, here's the Bookchemist once again. In a video that I filmed several years back, where I ranked my favorite Thomas Pynchon novels, I named Bleeding Edge as my favorite #1 Thomas Pynchon book. And I realized that that might sound like a bit of a weird choice in the canon of an author whose work spans 50 years and who has written several other novels that have now become part of the literary canon, definitely in the academic world, or at least the canon of so-called cult or difficult novels. Even for somebody like me who doesn't really like Thomas Pynchon's early novels very much, I don't hate them either, they're just not really my cup of tea. There are definitely other works that seem to be more likely candidates for the title of the best Thomas Pynchon novel, most definitely Against the Day or Mason and Dixon. Beyond the dick-measuring pointlessness of stating which book is the best compared to other books, I wanted to take a few minutes to explain, after a few weeks after my latest rereading of Bleeding Edge, why I think it's such a great novel and why it remains one of my favorite novels of all times. First and foremost, and this point is very difficult to overstate, Bleeding Edge is the first novel by a writer of my generation, the first book I've ever read which talks about the world as I've experienced from the perspective of someone who's lived through my own times. Let me explain. Bleeding Edge takes place in the course of a year, roughly between the spring of 2001 and the spring of 2002, a time that I remember myself. I was about 10 at the time. The novel revolves around two revolutions occurring at the time, slow-moving but of immense import. The rise of the internet and its newfound popularity, and the terror attacks of 9/11, especially on the World Trade Center in New York. But the novel is about so much more than these two topics, important though they may be. It captures the spirit and the atmosphere of the time. It understands the quality of its popular culture, of its zeitgeist. It talks about the enthusiasm for the release of Halo after the first trailers of the video game came out. It talks about the various psychological profiles of different Pokemon. It talks about how the characters from Friends were so important to the collective psyche of the time. It talks about the internet as a very new and very exciting playing field, a place that nobody fully understood but that clearly brought endless opportunities with it. And of course it talks about the change in atmosphere, about the acceleration of the times preceding the 9/11 attacks, compared with the paranoia, the fear and the uncertainty after the attacks. For me, and I'm sure for many of my peers, the horrors of 9/11 and the horrors of the wars that followed 9/11 came to shape and in some strange ways came to overlap with my own growth, the end of my childhood and my teenage years. 9/11 came to be perceived, definitely by me, almost as a watershed moment between a childhood of perceived innocence and an adulthood full of fear, contradiction, confusion and doubt. I'm sure it's one of the many reasons why my generation is so prone to nostalgia. There's a scene in Bleeding Edge where Ziggy and Otis, the children of the novel's protagonist Maxine, are using Departure, this very mysterious online website. I'll talk about it more in a minute. They're using Departure to rebuild New York City, to build a New York City of their own imagining, as it was before the 9/11 terror attacks. It's a very poignant scene, and it's a scene that talks very beautifully about my generation's nostalgia for a past of, again, perceived innocence, while at the same time remarking on how my generation has become so dependent on technology for its own escapism and its own entertainment. Many other great 21st century books have talked about the rise of the internet and its consequences on human interactions. A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan would be a great book that deals with the topic, and definitely many books have talked about New York City and about 9/11 in a similarly oblique way as Bleeding Edge. Chronic City by Jonathan Lethem is a personal favorite of mine. Yet none of these books, great though they are, speaks about 9/11, speaks about these pivotal historical moments from my own perspective, from the perspective I experienced it from, as somebody who was born in 1991, somebody who was still a child at the time. They clearly talk about these developments and these events from the perspective of somebody who is older, who grew up with different reference points, and to whom these events meant a lot, but they meant something different that they did for my generation. This point is difficult to stress and it's difficult to explain in many ways, but I do believe that Bleeding Edge is the first millennial novel, if you want to call it that. And the fact that this first millennial novel was written by an author who was actually 76 when the book came out boggles the mind so much that it's not even worth remarking on it. I called 9/11 a slow-moving revolution, and I think that's definitely part of the book's attitude toward the terror attacks. Bleeding Edge is definitely trying to separate the confusion and doubt and fear of the attacks themselves from their own meaning and their own consequences, from what they meant for the world and especially for the US at the time. Significantly, the novel never refers to the attacks as 9/11, but always as 11 September. 9/11 in itself as a name has become associated with an entire narrative almost about the attacks and about their reasons and about their consequences. And by calling them a different name, it's almost as if the novel is trying to rewrite or reassess the history of this moment. This doesn't mean that the novel is callous or even cruel when it comes to narrating the attacks. The pages that deal with the day of the terror attacks are among the most moving and impactful that Pynchon has ever written. At the same time, the novel is very careful to avoid turning these terror attacks into drama, to avoid using them as fodder for a very facile, a very tearful, even disingenuous treatment of this historical moment. Consider this: Bleeding Edge is especially contradictory, even for a Pynchon novel, when it comes to building up to the event, to the terror attacks. Something fishy is clearly going on in New York City and in the surrounding area prior to September 2001. The protagonist Maxine is investigating various cases of financial misconduct that might or might not be tied to the event. She and her friends stumble upon some fairly awful developments that the public clearly mustn't know about. But at the same time, it's impossible to assess, based on the events of the novel, whether the attacks, as portrayed in Bleeding Edge, were orchestrated by either the American government or a rogue branch of it, or whether they were an attack that surprised the United States and that caught the whole world by surprise. I remember that at the time that was an incredibly important question on everybody's mind. My memory of the wars that followed 9/11 is that everybody hated them. Everybody hated the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, except that some people believed that they were unnecessary evil, something that had to be done in order to fight terror and to prevent further terror attacks, whereas other people believed that they'd all been organized by the United States themselves, that perhaps the United States had arranged the terror attacks in the first place to have a casus belli to invade these countries. Bleeding Edge, however, by showing both options, the conspiracy theory option and the genuine terror attack possibility as equally valid, almost seems to point at the pointlessness of either. The exact nature of the attacks is bound to remain a mystery, but what is not at all mysterious is the state of the world where the attacks took place. A world where immense poverty and immense suffering has to be endured in the vast majority of the planet, so that the richer part of the planet can enjoy incredibly high standards of living. A world where the excesses of the West are directly responsible for a lot of that poverty, and a world where immense amounts of harm and violence have to be endured to keep up the pretense of freedom that we enjoy, that keyword that was tossed around a lot back in the day. This, of course, doesn't justify any death, least of all the deaths that followed the 9/11 terror attacks, but is almost a cry for a more dignified and intelligent reaction to these events. Definitely a more dignified and intelligent one than the rather ugly cry for vengeance and war that was raised as a consequence of the act, and that came to shape the world for the decades, definitely the next 10 years, and really the world we're still living in. To put it differently and more simply, Pynchon deals with extreme dignity and clarity, a historical time that was very murky, very confusing, and that tends to get people really worked up. The internet in the novel, that other side of Bleeding Edge, is just another stage for the same type of dynamics that are also at play when it comes to foreign policy and it comes to the more tangible world. The world's a stage, they used to say. These days, maybe the world's a screen. The internet in Bleeding Edge is a place of immense possibility, a place of boundless freedom, where people can come to create new communities and new relationships outside the domain of the market, but it's also a place that's highly corruptible and highly susceptible to the demands of the market itself. A world that almost seems to be waiting just for the market to arrive, split it up, and put a price tag on anything. The development of NFTs in recent news brought to mind Bleeding Edge to be very much, and that picture of the future that the novel portrays and creates as a place where the internet is just going to become commodified up to the last megabyte. Departure, that mysterious website at the heart of the novel, is also part of this same contradictory landscape. It's a place of great solace, of immense escape, but it's also defined as a meretricious geek paradise, a place that looks a little bit more commodified every time you log into it. Among the many, many impossible mysteries in the novel, that alien under Montauk, those time-traveling secret agents, Departure is the one I find most compelling. What the hell even is Departure? It's not supposed to be a video game, but it has forerunners in the video game world. It's supposed to be a website, but also has strangely good graphics. It's highly immersive. It's so immersive that you can sink entire days of your life into it. It's so immersive that you might not even realize or remember whether you've logged out of it or you're still logged in. Departure, to me, is one of those great Pynchonian paradoxes. It is at once very much what it says on the tin. It is a website developed in the early 21st century United States, and definitely talks about the state of the internet at that specific place in time and space. But it is also a metaphor for something greater, a metaphor, I think, for human imagination and for our capacity to escape the confines of reality. In the same way as the Chums of Chance in Against the Day, another great Pynchon novel, are at once definitely characters in the novel, real characters interacting with the others, but also a synecdoche for the entirety of popular art and adventure stories at the time in the 19th century. By spending some time in Departure, Maxine, the novel's protagonist, comes to experience the full potential extension of human imagination. Departure is a place where you can rebuild lost worlds, commute with people you thought you'd lost forever, even bring the dead back to life. It's also a place that's immensely vulnerable to the influence of those in a position of power, and a place that has to be protected and defended actively if we want to take it away from those who would try to split it up and sell it back to us. I really adore Bleeding Edge. I really love it. I love its mysteries. I love how compelling they are, even while forever remaining unsolvable. I love its invectives against suburban living. I love how it's clearly smitten with New York City, while also being highly aware of its problems, its sense of entitlement, how open it is to the corruptibility of developers and greedy landlords, etc. It's not just a facile love letter to the city that ignores its problems. I love the way it uses so many literary genres, most notably horror and science fiction, to talk about the strangeness of modern life, and of course, as a Pynchon fan, I love its puns and its jokes and its many crazy subplots. Bleeding Edge is probably Pynchon's most accessible novel, alongside Inherent Vice. But Inherent Vice feels much more Pynchonian, much more representative of Pynchon's style, whereas Bleeding Edge is fairly unique in his canon. It is definitely Pynchon's least arch and least ironic novel. Michael Chabon has written a beautiful review of Bleeding Edge, there's a link to it in the description box, where he argues that this is the book where Pynchon came to grips with the limits of irony and with the demands of parenthood. So much of the book is dedicated to Maxine's concern for her kids, trying to raise them as good humans in such a difficult, contradictory, violent and terrible world. In fact, the character of Marge Keller in the novel, a leftist activist who is always ready with a new conspiracy theorist to blame any problem that crops up in the novel on the American government, almost feels like Pynchon making fun of himself at his most belligerent. That, of course, doesn't mean that Bleeding Edge refrains from making a political stand. The entire novel, just as the entirety of Pynchon's oeuvre, is one long, dignified political stand, and Bleeding Edge is also, I would say, his most grounded novel at the same time. The one where it was easiest, at least for me, to connect the characters' moral and practical dilemmas throughout the narrative with my own dilemmas as somebody living in the 21st century and trying to be a decent person. These are some of the reasons why I adore it so much, and I look forward to hearing from you, really. Let me know in the comments what you think of Bleeding Edge, if you agree with me in considering it one of Pynchon's best novels, or if you weren't quite convinced by it. Has it grown on you with rereadings? Do you think you won't even bother giving it a second chance? I look forward to hearing what you think about the book, and I always like talking about the books I like in the comments with you guys. Thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you to my patrons for sponsoring the YouTube channel and supporting my videos and my reviews, and I'll see you all in a next video, whatever that means. Bye everybody.